This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Oh, hey there. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. First, I would like to remind you that I am still looking for those cannibal expert recommendations. Don't forget to send me one. I haven't gotten any yet, and it makes me a little sad. For the actual show today, this is a very old episode. I taped this back in January of 2020 when we were foolish and knew nothing about COVID, and it is super surreal listening to a face-to-face conversation. I actually think this is the last interview that I taped in person, and I really miss that, you know? Anyway, for this show, I talked to Dr. Young at UCSF about the kind of overlappy sections of the Venn diagrams of evolution, development, and biology, and how he uses limbs as models to understand the interaction between the three. It's kind of technical, and this is going to be a great show. So enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Gabby LaPera. Joining me here today is Dr. Nathan Young. We're in his office here at San Francisco General Hospital. So if you hear any sirens, that's why, because sick people also come here. He's
Absolutely,
nodding.
yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Dr. Young?
Sure. My name is Dr. Nathan Young. I often don't go by that, though. I'm an evolutionary biologist here at UCSF. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Orthopedic Surgery, and I'm also the director of the master's program in oral and craniofacial sciences.
Okay, I think you should definitely wind it back a little bit and tell me how an anthropologist ended up in an orthopedic surgery department.
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and I often wonder that to myself quite a bit. I always imagine myself being faculty in an anthropology department, so this is, it's different than I had imagined. It's sort of a natural progression, though. If you think about what orthopedic surgeons are really interested in, orthopedic surgeons are interested in bones and healing bones, obviously, whereas many anthropologists, especially biological anthropologists, are interested in bones because they're the remnants. They're the things that we find in the fossil record, obviously fossilized bones. And so there's kind of a natural relationship between the two, in the sense that we're both interested in bones. The way that I specifically got into this was, over time, I realized that my interest in understanding how bones come to be, how they get their particular form and function, is really associated with, or you really need to know a lot about how they're formed. You need to know how they grow, how they develop from the earliest time frames up until adults. Because what we see in the fossil record, they're the bones of individuals, but those bones have a history. There's the history of the individual, and then there's the phylogenetic or the evolutionary history of those bones as well. And so tying those things together is really what brought me to this kind of department, where we merge the mechanistic side, where we try to understand how bones grow, with the evolutionary history of the bones as well.
See, that was a really great explanation, and you kind of backed into my next question, which is that you describe yourself as an evolutionary developmental biologist, which is 3 words that describe like huge fields, and then you stick them all together, and you spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get them to all talk to each other and like what insights can cross-pollinate. Right.
So, the thing about evolution and development, they're both historical questions. So evolutionary biology, there's a historical contingency that's associated with it, right? Because we all represent an unbroken, continuous chain of being, right? From the beginning of time.
I'm going to stop you for a second there, because I think about that sometimes when I like have trouble opening a jar of peanut butter. I'm like, how sad would my ancestors be that I cannot open this jar? They survived the savannas of Africa and like the countless climatological events, and here I am in my kitchen.
But think how impressed your protozoan, ancestors would be. They're like, wow, you're multicellular. That's pretty amazing. How did you do that?
I love that.
Yeah. So, but we're all unbroken chains, right? So from the beginning of life until us sitting here talking to each other. But what that means is there's a lot of historical contingency involved, which is that previous events affect current events. And so that helps to explain both, the idiosyncrasies of life and the special nature of it as well. And so that's evolution is historical. Development is also historical. It's kind of in miniature though, right? So we also as individuals we start off as one cell, and now we're trillions of cells, and we maintained that integrity as an individual over that whole course of changing, multiplying. And that's pretty incredible if you think about it, because it's much different than like an engineered product, like a car, for example, or any sort of complex thing that we think about. So there's no end product in sight, right? You don't have a plan for producing you as the adult. Well, I should back up. There is a plan, but it's not as if you have a blueprint and then this is, here are the parts and we're just going to take these parts and we're going to produce you. Right? You have to go from the single cell, and then, all sorts of transformations have to occur to those single cell, maintaining homeostasis, maintaining functional integrity to produce you as an adult, right? And then you have children maybe, and then then that process continues, right?
Sure, and then you can even add other things like environmental factors that affect development.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are all sorts of things that impinge on it. So the developmental process is really important, because whereas, with a car, for example, you might trade in and out parts are interchangeable and replaceable. Mm-hmm. In humans, they're less, in any organism, they're less replaceable. I mean, you can replace parts at some level, but you lose this kind of integrity. And so that makes organisms really quite special, right? And so understanding the historical contingency of development is really quite important as well. In other words, earlier events are going to affect later events, and those are going to be important for understanding how different forms arise, how different types of organisms arise. And, going back to your original question, how do I get into orthopedic surgery? Well, it's also important for understanding how developmental disorders occur, so birth defects, occur because development goes awry at some level. And so, I mean, it's they're these two kind of historically contingent processes, and they're really important for understanding how organisms achieve their current shape, size, form, and everything else.
Yeah, so I want to talk to you a little bit about a paper that you wrote and kind of tease out a little bit more about what you're saying. It's integrating Evo and Devo. Is that how you pronounce it, or Devo?
I'd probably say Devo, yeah.
Okay, let's do it that way. I like the band, so I'm in. Integrating Evo and Devo, the limb as model structure. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that really impressed me when I was reading this paper is that there are evolutionary constraints on development, and then there's developmental constraints on the forms that you can get in evolution. Mm-hmm. And so you're really trying to understand, I think the fundamental question that you're trying to understand is variation and what roles each play in the variation that actually arises in creatures.
Yeah, exactly. So again, going back to these historical contingency aspects, so they're this interplay between the two. So what I really liked about the limb, and what I tried to convey in the paper, was I remember having a biology textbook that actually showed this sort of classic diagram where you see the similarities between different animals' limbs, but you also see the diversity.
Sure.
So there's this tension between the two, right? And I think what I found as I got more into the developmental biology was that developmental biologists weren't very interested in variation. They're very much into mechanism. And at the opposite extreme, anthropologists were very into variation and diversity, but they had no way of actually operationalizing, trying to understand the mechanisms by which those things occurred. And so what I was hoping with this paper was to really highlight some of the work that I've been trying to do with limbs, to show how the different perspectives really help to understand or help inform each other, actually telling you something very important about each. So from the evolutionary perspective, we see certain types of diversity, but not as much as you might predict in certain directions.
Let's give tangible examples, I think, for listeners. So you mentioned seeing a picture in your biology textbook. I think anyone who took Intro to Biology saw the same one, and it's a picture of a dolphin flipper and a bat wing and a horse leg and maybe a human arm, and you can see that the same bones exist in all of these different creatures.
Right. Right, so all these different creatures have the same bones, but then the question is, how do they get their different proportions?
Right, in different shapes and
different shapes and
different
sizes,
kind
yeah.
of reasons of being, the raison d'être.
Yeah, and so I think the thing is, when you look at those pictures, it gives kind of a false sense of diversity. There is a lot of diversity there, but my original question, I think, was how much diversity is really represented there? And so that's an evolutionary question, and so we can address it from that perspective. And then from the developmental side, I realized that a lot of developmental biologists had approached it, they approach it from a model systems perspective. And so they might just look at a model species would be like a mouse, for example, or a chicken. And so they try to explain the system, how it works in those particular species, but they don't try to understand how those systems can be reused to produce diversity. So there's kind of a disconnect between the two, right? So one is focused on the mechanism by which you produce these different elements that make up the limb. And then at the other extreme, you have people looking at the diversity, but not trying to understand how it actually gets generated. So
what do we do?
So I don't have I don't have all the answers. Really, for this paper, I was just trying to point out from the data some sort of key hypotheses that could be shown, that could be tested. At one level, from the evolutionary perspective, what I was showing is that there is a lot of diversity, but again, it's limited in very interesting ways.
Right, and so when you say diversity, you mean in the overall, functional morphology as opposed to the undergirding bones.
Right, well, so animals use their limbs in different ways, but if you essentially only have 3 segments, and so the question is, how can those segments vary in meaningful ways? And one of the major ways in which they vary is their proportions. So the element that's closest to the body might be a certain size, the next element might be another size, and the last elements, for example, your hand or foot, might be another size.
Right. So, in this case, sorry, just to make it clear. So in this case, we're talking about your humerus. So that's your upper arm bone. That's the part closest to your body, and then your radius and ulna is the medial or middle part, and then the distal part is your hand or foot.
Right. And so if you think about a bat, for example, a bat has relatively short humerus, but it has really long, its finger bones are highly elongated, so the hands are really quite long. And then if trying to think of an opposite extreme. So an elephant, for example, has really short feet, but has really long proximal elements. And so how do you generate those differences? And if you took it from the developmental perspective, most of the models were completely agnostic to how this occurs. In fact, from all of the data that they've collected, it seemed like, they seem to assume that chickens and mice representing birds and mammals all did these things in the exact same way, yet they have much different proportions. And so, well, it suggested that that they really didn't know how these things occurred, that it's kind of left up in the air.
It's just
basically.
the way it is.
It's just the way it is, right? There's no why. It's kind of like it's beyond their purview. They don't really care because it's beyond development, right? So these things are produced, and maybe it's just growth. Maybe they just change in proportion over time. Now, from the evolutionary perspective, it's always touted how much diversity there is, but as it turns out, there's not as much diversity as you might expect, right? And so, as it turns out, the middle segment for lots of different systems that have 3 parts to them, the middle segment is pretty much almost always 1/3 the proportion of everything else, and it's relatively static. So its length might change, but as its length changes, everything else's length changes in a way. In other words, there's a trade-off between the more proximal or the closer elements and the ones that are distal, which is more distant. But the middle segment is about 1/3. And so
I think the way to think about this, if you want a real world example that applies to you, is if you are resizing a picture and you check that little box that says keep proportions the same, that means that no matter how much you change one side, the other side is going to change in response.
Yeah. Basically, it just means that the middle segment, for some reason, is not quite that variable. And so I noticed this from the data, and I want to know why that could be. So that led me to thinking more about the developmental systems themselves and how they actually might be constrained. Because I've tried to argue that that there's a developmental basis for this lack of diversity in the middle segment, but it doesn't have to be. There could be really strong functional reasons for it as well. And if you think about something that has three parts, if the middle segment is quite small or if it's quite large, and relative to the proximal and distal portions, it actually might not be particularly functional. So that's one possibility. But then there's also the possibility that there's a developmental reason. In other words, the proportions fill out in that way, and then it acts as a limitation, as a developmental bias later in the evolution of these particular limbs.
Well, and one of the things I saw in your paper was that animals that have like a strong functional association, for example, quadrupeds, so like a horse or a dog, they have a greater limb integration in terms of things being proportional across all limbs.
Right. So this goes back to the sort of the integration between the fact that organisms grow, they have this historical contingency to them, and the fact that evolution tends to be fairly parsimonious, in the sense that parsimonious, I guess, not the right word here. Maybe lazy. It's lazy, right? So,
okay.
Right. So evolution is lazy in the sense that it's not going to come up with a completely new system to do something. It's going to use the tools that it already has to build something else. And so limbs, from the fossil record, we know that limbs are duplications of one another. They're duplicated. And so the genetics for limbs gets duplicated in a new place. And so that means that they're using the same tools over and over again.
And that's what y'all call homology.
Yeah. So there's a homology there. There's a genetic homology, and there are lots of things in your body that are used over and over again, different places, and then as they take on new functions and they get isolated to a particular zone or region, they take on new roles and they can change, and all sorts of crazy and wacky things can happen. But with limbs, they seem to have this underlying logic to them, which is duplicated in the forelimb and the hind limb. And so that's really important, we think, because that's, suggests selection might be occurring on one limb versus another, that actually drags, if there's selection on the forelimb, it might drag along selection on the hind limb.
If you're a quadruped and you're using them the same way. So what happens if you're, say, an ape that likes to swing from branch to branch?
Yeah, so...
And you're using your forelimbs very differently than your hind limbs.
Yeah, so, what we think happens there, or what we hypothesize, is that if you go from an ancestor that's quadruped and, you like to have your limbs be well coordinated with one another for locomotion reasons, as those constraints, those locomotory constraints are reduced, that selection will act on your limbs in different ways and actually free them to accrue more variation. They don't need to be coordinated with one another. That was our hypothesis that we put out a long time ago. In 2005, we wrote a paper where we were looking at how limbs, the fancy word for it is covary with one another. So how variation in the forelimb and arms are coordinated with variation in the legs. And what we found is that animals that don't use their limbs in the same way, the covariation was reduced. And so we realized that, primates, it's kind of funny because, we were anthropologists and we were looking all over the place, all these different animals. We realized later, much later, that we had a perfect data set and we had perfect animals to test some of these hypotheses in, because primates really are a test case for these kinds of posed relationships, because we have lots of quadrupeds in terms of monkeys, for example, and we have lots of suspensory type animals like apes, and then we have humans, of course, where we don't use our limbs in the same way. And so we just tested. We just looked to see how variation was associated between forelimb and hind limb in these different groups, and we found that indeed, that the covariation between them is actually quite reduced in apes. Now, there's really a cause and effect. We're not sure what the cause and effect is necessarily. So it could be that, or a chicken and egg, I guess. Does the reduction selection actually precede and then freeze variation to accrue, or is it really a constraint that drives selection in one direction or another? We don't know that for sure, but what we did know by looking at this in terms of the evolutionary history of these different groups is that because apes have this really low covariation, what we suggested in humans was that the covariation between legs and arms was reduced as well in our common ancestor with chimpanzees. And that really freed our arms and legs to really diverge in interesting ways that allowed things like bipedalism to evolve in the way that they did. we still see that signal in humans. Humans are really quite interesting because of the amount of variation that we actually have in our arms and legs. If you went and looked at 1,000 humans, which I probably have over my career, you would find that all these arms and legs, you just stand out on a street corner and watch people walk by, we come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and variations, right?
And part of that is biological, and then again, part of that is people affecting themselves.
Yeah, and I think, it's...
like if you were to look at an arm wrestler versus me, a very sad, dainty editor that spends all day typing at a computer, like we'd look really different.
Yeah, and part of it is the sort of plasticity and the fact that one person's probably heavily working out and the other one's typing a lot, right? But yeah, I think at the most extremes, you think about Olympic athletes, for example.
Sure.
And there you see like the selection of sports. They're selecting for people of particular body types because it's the extremes of performance. And so...
Right, like Michael Phelps.
Michael Phelps, right? Really long torso, really long arms. And although he's really tall, he has relatively short legs, and then he's got really long feet. So it's like the perfect body type to power yourself through the water, right? He's like a boat. But then, if you're going to be a gymnast, it's a much different thing. Or you want to be at the highest performance in terms of weightlifting. It's yet another thing. And so all these different body types really, they're out there. We have enough people like, with what are we at? 8 billion people now? I think
we're at 8.
Yeah, we're at 8 billion people. That's a lot of potential variance. I remember we had a famous, I can't remember her name now. She studies domesticated dogs, and she came and gave a really fascinating talk. And she said, with dog breeds, it's a great system because we have so much variation. So many different, some that you wouldn't see in humans. And I raised my hand. I said, I think you do see as much variation in humans. I mean, if you looked at, General Tom Thumb, the famous small person, but I think he was proportional. So he's a very tiny person. And he was with P.T. Barnum's circus. And you compared him to the world's tallest person, right, who is maybe 8 feet tall. I mean, the differences in scale there are almost as large as you would see in different breeds of dogs.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's amazing how much variation we actually have. And in some ways, we're a kind of a perfect model system for understanding variation. Anyway, I've really gotten off topic there, but...
No, it's fine. I think it's really important to have these kind of winding conversations because it is kind of the way that science works, and especially anthropology, where you're drawing relationships between a lot of different fields.
Yeah, I think anthropology really it's a consumer field. There's not an underlying theory that's necessarily driving all of it. It's just everyone's interested in humans, and because we're naturally fascinated in ourselves, and we try to find all kinds of information from different fields that will help us to understand those sort of key questions about what it is to be a human.
Yeah, I jokingly say that anthropology is the field that you would pick if you really liked, like Cosmo quizzes, like what beverage are you, or whatever. It's the exact type of, because people ultimately want to know about themselves and why we are the way we are. Anthropology is the field that really tries to answer that.
Yeah, if you're a praying mantis, I'm sure you would be really fascinated with praying mantis.
Exactly.
Human stuff would be really for the eccentric praying mantis, but trying to understand,
Okay, cool. So is there anything that you wish people knew about your field? Is there anything that you want to say to people about what you study that you haven't gotten a chance to say?
Anything I would want to say about my field?
Or about yourself. I don't know. Maybe you just have like a PSA for people too. Like, don't stand on the left side of the escalator.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think when I was starting out in anthropology, I'm not sure what made me say I want to be an anthropologist, but I said it fairly young when I was in high school. I was just like, someone said, what do you want to do when you go to college? And I was like, I want to study anthropology. And I don't know why.
That's wild.
Yeah, I'm not sure why that was. I mean, I'm not even sure I completely understood what that meant, but it just sounded really cool to me. And I think if I saw what I was doing now, I might not have the same idea as what it was. But I think with anything, it's you kind of start pulling at a thread that's kind of interesting to you, and you keep on following it. And it leads you to all sorts of weird places. And that's the nice thing about academia, is it kind of rewards you for following, weird questions or things that just kind of fascinate you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be, the cliche is like follow your passion. And it's like, well, I mean, I don't know if this was my passion, but it was the thing that interested me the most, right? So it was really kind of just following that thread. And when I try to explain to people like why it is the things that I do, I mean, I can look back at my CV and the things that I've written, and I can see the narrative thread there. I can see why I went from place to place. To the outside, it might not seem as logical, but it's important to you, right? We spend our lives doing stuff, and it's important to do things that are, that you find interesting.
You want to know why, and I think that's
Yeah.
like a pretty admirable reason for being the way that you are. There's this really common phrase, which is curiosity killed the cat.
Mm-hmm.
But what I don't think most people know is that the rest of it is curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back.
Yeah.
It kind of encapsulates your advice for potential future anthropologists.
Yeah, I think, just about every job you're going to do out there is going to involve some form of drudgery. And I spend many hours staring at grants or staring at papers or modifying just small things, and it can seem kind of overwhelming, but there are moments where you have clarity, and that's really what makes it worthwhile. And I keep on saying, well, maybe this is my last paper. And I keep on coming back for more. I keep on coming up, or maybe this is my last idea. I don't know where I'm going to have a new idea, but I keep on coming up with new ideas. You just keep on following them because they're interesting to you.
Yeah.
You keep on following it.
No, I totally get it. It's that intellectual itch.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's that time of the interview where I ask you about your reading habits.
Mm-hmm.
Typically called the most challenging portion of this interview. So first question is, if people wanted to learn more about what you do, what's a good starting point? Like, what's a good thing that they could read to become familiar with? You have a very big field, so this is a very difficult question for you in particular, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's like one thing. I'm trying to think the books that maybe fascinated me the most when I was younger. No, there's a book by, I want to say it's called, maybe it's Stuart Carroll. It's a book, I want to say it's like Endless Forms Most Beautiful or something like that.
I can find it based off that.
Yeah, so there, there's another book more recently by Neil Shubin called Your Inner Fish. These are all books about, and I think there's probably a book by Dan Lieberman more recently about the human body.
Yeah, I actually finished reading that a couple of weeks ago. It was great.
Yeah, so there are books like that where it's basically, I think that's what turned me on the most when I first started graduate school, is the fascination of, I think a lot of people originally, anatomy can seem kind of boring to a lot of people because it's a lot of memorization of pieces and parts and things like that, and names in Latin.
Those are all people who haven't taken a human dissection lab with a cadaver.
That's right. Well, that can certainly be a searing experience, but for a really good anatomy instructor, I think what they bring out is the peculiar. God, that's a hard word to say.
Peculiarities.
I can't say it, but you
can.
You. Thank you. Of the human body, but also and that's again going back to the historical nature of it. Why is that part there? And that doesn't make any sense here and there.
That's where a lot of kind of intro to biology concepts came from too, is in the early days when they still called it natural history. It was the 1700s, people looking at a frog and being like, why?
Yeah.
Why do you look the way you look? How do you come from being a tadpole to having limbs everywhere?
Yeah, or even why a frog would have the same essential body organs as a human being, right?
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, it's wild. So trying to put all those pieces together. So I think really good anatomists or teachers, they put all those things together. It's more than just a collection of parts that you get names for. You get this kind of like story of, oh, you understand why that part gets to be where it is. So I think books like that are really, not sure if I actually said any books, but
You said 3.
Okay, good.
And I will post all of them on the website like I always do.
Yeah, those I think would be really good. But yeah, I think more than that is actually, if you ever have a chance to take an anatomy course with a really good anatomy instructor, I think most people would say that those were formative experiences for them.
Yeah, it definitely was for me.
Yeah.
And it was for that one kid who thought he was going into the pool, and instead he walked into our cadaver lab.
There you go.
Pretty sure it scarred him for life. Okay, so second question is, what are you reading right now for work?
Right now for work, I'm reading a paper by David Jablonski. I like it because it says a lot of the same things that are in this paper that we talked about earlier.
You like it because he agrees with you.
Well, no, I like it because he's much more lucid than I am. And he uses much less quotation marks, and he has more examples. And I started reading it, I just was agreeing with everything he said. And it's like, wow, that really, said what I wanted to say, but it said it a lot better.
That's really cool when that happens,
yeah,
actually.
Yeah, so I like that. He also cited me at least once, so that's important too. So that's what I'm reading for work. Beyond that is just lots of technical papers as I rewrite a grant, trying to find more evidence.
Do you know what the name of that article is, by chance? I can wait while you roll over and get it.
I found it. It's called Developmental Bias, Macroevolution, and the Fossil Record.
Cool.
By David Jablonski.
I will, again, post that online. Well, at least I'll post a PubMed link to it if it's not.
And it's in Evolution and Development. Yes. That's a good paper. I really liked it.
Awesome. I'll see if I can find it. I've read some of his stuff, and I actually agree with you that he's a really good writer. I think that's something that's really special when it comes to science, is someone who can really get their point across.
Yeah, and I think what's amazing about this is it's got some good figures in it, but it's also, you get a sense of he's like a generation and a half ahead of me, and so he just has like an encyclopedic knowledge. He has a greater base of information and brings in lots of different examples, and it's really powerful. So it's good stuff.
Awesome. Okay, last question, and then I will release you back to your Jablonski article.
Mm-hmm.
What are you reading right now for fun?
Right now I'm reading a book by Ian Banks. It's called A Player of Games. It's a science fiction book. It's part of his Culture series. I got into it because I had never heard of him. I had read a lot of science fiction, but I heard about him because he was the favorite science fiction author of Paul Krugman, who's the New York Times opinion writer, Nobel Prize winner for economics, Princeton professor. And so I'd read his blog, and he talked about, this was one of his favorites. I guess he died maybe 5 or 6 years ago, not Krugman, but the Banks. And so he had written something about him. So I started reading some of his work, and I actually really liked it because I have a lot of problem with a lot of science fiction, which I love reading science fiction, and I've also read a lot of fantasy of my life, but I can't read it as much anymore because, fantasy pretty much has the same formula over and over again. And then science fiction also has kind of a formula to it as well. And although I like space operas and things like that, the more I thought about the biology of aliens and things like that, the more frustrated I got because, it seemed unlikely. Why do they always look like us? Do they have to look like us? Basically, it's a question, an evolutionary question. If life arises somewhere else and you have life forms that can go out into the stars, and what would they be like? Do they have to be like us? And it's sort of the lack of imagination for most science fiction is lacking. I wouldn't say that Ian Banks, some of the biology is not that great, but
the next person I interview will be an exobiologist.
Yeah, you should have. What's life going to be like out there? I guess maybe we'll never know. So.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. I know that it's kind of crazy that someone just emails you out of the blue and is like, hey.
No, I'm always excited to know that actually someone might have read one of my papers.
Yeah, I read it in depth and I highlighted it. It was very exciting.
Yeah, so I have evidence now that at least one person has read one of my papers. So that's always exciting.
Hopefully many more after at least 2 people listen to this podcast.
Maybe
my mom
2.
and my dad will definitely listen to this podcast.
I look forward to their comments. If they have any ideas, that'd be great.
All right. Well, thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Oh, hi. You made it to the end. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. Also, don't forget to send me recommendations for researchers who study creatures who lunch on their own kind. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.